Welcome to our live virtual Chicago law firm info and networking session. This is another great session as part of our Summer Associate Hub live virtual location series where students can learn about what it's like to work as a BigLaw attorney in different locations. We have a fantastic panel of attorneys today. I'm excited to get into it. My name is Albert from Summer Associate Hub. Before we jump in, the agenda is as follows. We'll have a panel discussion featuring our attorneys from Winston and Strawn, Willkie, and Foley and Lardner. That will be about 30 to 40 minutes, including Q&A. After the panel discussion, each firm will also host a separate Zoom room for those who want to join. I guess technically one is a Zoom room, one's a Teams room, and maybe another one is a Zoom room, but we're calling them Zoom rooms to be convenient. For those who want to join, you can ask questions, listen it's to hear the attorneys and the recruiting folks chat about what it's like to work at the firm in that location. In the meantime, please use the Q&A function to ask questions for the panel generally. We'll tee those up later for any good questions that we get. Those are all anonymous unless you prefer not to be anonymous. And then before we wrap up the panel discussion, the best part about this is we'll also have some fun prize raffles for firm swag sponsored by each firm. That's always a fun thing. You have to be present to win. We'll be sending a link in the chat for you to sign up for the raffle, and then we'll be calling your name out, so don't go anywhere before the end of that. All right, so what is Summer Associate Hub? Summer Associate Hub is a free content and resource hub for law students embarking on the 1L and 2L recruiting process. I'm a former law student and a BigLaw associate. We know here from our own experience how hard it is as a 1L to understand what it's really like to work at a law firm. Our platform, summerassociatehub.com, has blog posts, podcast episodes, short video tutorials, exercises, interviews with attorneys, and other content to help you learn about practice areas and prepare for the recruiting process. We also host live virtual programs. You know about that because you're watching one right now, where students can easily learn directly from and network with law firm attorneys and recruiting team members. We have a ton of awesome programs scheduled. We had a bunch already, which are all recorded. So you can check out summerassociatehub.com /video-library. And you can also check out some of the sessions we have coming up, including our real estate practice session tomorrow and our Philadelphia location session next week, as well as finance and capital markets practice next week. We're also in the process of planning an in-person networking opportunity this summer in New York City, so stay tuned for that as well. All right, well, the link to RSVP for all that and the links for the breakout rooms and the raffle, that'll all be sent in the chat, so keep an eye on the Zoom chat throughout the session and take down those notes. And I think it's time for us to get into it. So instead of me introducing everyone, well, looks like we lost one. We'll pull him back in. Well, instead of me introducing everyone, I'll let everyone introduce themselves. So I guess Matt, let's start with you. So I guess introduce yourself and your practice and briefly why you chose to practice in Chicago.
Sure, of course. Hey, good evening, everybody. Welcome. Really excited to participate in the event tonight. So I am a litigation partner at Willkie here in Chicago. I do two kinds of law, really. Primarily complex commercial litigation, which really means mostly big companies suing each other. So generally, our matters, for the most part, are not individuals on either side of the V, unless it's a class action or some type of employment litigation. But usually the litigation that we handle is one big company suing another big company. I also do a number of what's called internal investigations. And what that is if you think, the easiest way to think about it is if a company, for example, has an anonymous hotline and somebody calls in and says that they witnessed X, Y, or Z, and that the allegation is sufficient enough to kind of run its way up through the legal chain. Companies often hire outside law firms, or the board will hire an outside law firm to investigate those allegations. So look forward to a great discussion tonight and answering whatever questions you guys have.
Great, thanks, Matt. Dan, on to you. Tell us more about yourself, your practice, and why you chose to practice in Chicago.
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Dan Flaherty. I'm a fifth-year associate at Foley and Lardner. I'm in our firm's intellectual property litigation practice, and that practice covers disputes involving patents, copyrights, trademark, trade dress, trade secrets, and in a variety of venues, including district court, proceedings before the Patent and Trademark Office, and also the International Trade Commission, or ITC. So far, my practice has been focused primarily on patent litigation on behalf of both plaintiffs and defendants. generally involving one company suing another for infringement of their patents, sometimes counterclaims, the companies sue each other over their respective patents. And most of my work so far has been in district court, but also some experience and involvement in matters at the ITC and appeals to the Federal Circuit, which is the appeals court that hears patent cases. I chose to practice in Chicago because Chicago is home for me. I grew up about an hour west of here in Aurora. My family's here, I have friends here, and so I always knew I wanted to come back and put down roots here. That might have been a tougher decision if Chicago weren't on its own an amazing city to live in, but the family tie was a big part of it for me.
Great. Thanks, Dan. So Kurt, on to you. You joined back in the nick of time. So tell us more about you, your practice, and briefly why you chose to practice in Chicago.
Yeah, great. And good evening, everyone. Sorry about the technical difficulties. Kurt Mathas, a litigation and trial lawyer at Winston and Strawn. My practice spans a fairly broad range of commercial litigation, including things like breach of contract cases, products liability cases. But the thing that I do the most is IP and specifically patent litigation. I've been at Winston as a litigator my whole career, and chose to come to Chicago out of law school. I grew up in the Midwest, went to a Big Ten college and Notre Dame for law school, and made the somewhat natural progression to the biggest city in the Midwest, Chicago, to start my career, and I really enjoyed it.
Great. So, and this is great. And as somebody, I think everyone here spent a lot of time in Chicago, and I think that's one of the best parts about the Midwest. As somebody who I think I've spent probably 72 hours total in Chicago, which I wish it were more. I think I'm going to learn a lot from this session too. So, Kurt, we're going to stay with you. So, in your practice, doing all those different types of litigation, I guess, what are the clients in the industries that make up the Chicago market specifically, and how does the location of Chicago in the Midwest play into your practice?
Yeah, so obviously Chicago is a big market, and a very diverse market. We are a sort of industrially rooted city, going back to the early days of law in the Midwest, and obviously today we've grown to be a major tech hub, a major life sciences hub. We have a very robust private equity scene in Chicago. And so between sort of tech, healthcare, a lot of pharmaceutical and healthcare related companies here, we obviously have major research institutions in the University of Chicago, Northwestern, Rush, UIC, et cetera. And so there's a vast array of industries that are represented, and a huge client base that spans everything from Fortune 50 companies all the way down through a healthy startup scene.
And so, Matt, what about you from your practice?
Yeah, and I guess, Albert, I apologize, I didn't answer the second part of your first question. I grew up, Chicago is a natural progression for me. I grew up, I'm actually a city person, grew up on the north side of the city. My wife, who's also a lawyer, grew up on the south side of the city. So we're both city people, live in the city now. I have two daughters who we raised in the city. So it was a logical progression. Albert, I think with respect to the city of Chicago, obviously, I agree with everything Kurt said. Business hub, large companies, big companies in the state of Illinois, kind of a emerging tech scene in what we call the West Loop here as well. Google, Groupon, lots of companies have recently joined. The one thing I will say, though, to the first years who are listening is that my experience has been, if you go to work for a big firm like any of the three that you see here, you should fully expect to handle cases all across the United States. I think that I currently have probably 6 or 7 active litigation matters, only one of which is actually here in the city of Chicago. I've tried cases in California, in Alabama, in Texas, in Florida, in New York City, all across. I think that particularly with respect to litigation practices, which I'm most familiar with, Big firms have sophisticated clients, large sophisticated clients who have large legal issues that find their way to state and federal courts across the country, and then many times, even internationally. So Chicago is a great place for anyone thinking about starting her or his law career. But I find myself having many active cases, many places other than Chicago.
Great, and that's a great point. So Dan, tell us about your practice and how the city and the location of Chicago and the Midwest play into that.
Sure. Well, I would echo what Matt said in that location really doesn't play all that big of a role in my practice as far as constraining the kinds of cases that I work on and the clients I work for. In the last few years, our IP litigation practice for Chicago-based companies has tended to be more concentrated in manufacturing, finance, insurance, healthcare, some food and beverage. But really working on cases that are for Chicago-based companies has really been the exception rather than the rule for me. So far, I've worked on a case for Morton Salt. That's a Chicago company. But most of my work has involved clients in different states and with attorneys in our different offices, DC, Boston, New York, LA, recently Salt Lake City, and of course, Milwaukee, our headquarters as well.
You make an interesting point on this topic around, which I think is a very important thing for law students to keep in mind of where you choose to practice geographically. It doesn't always dictate the types of clients and industries you work on. So I'm going to throw in a surprise question, I guess, a follow up to Dan and Matt. How does that play into bar licensure? I think that's a question that a lot of students might have. Is it by choosing a particular location and taking the bar in that state? What is it? I guess how does that work in terms of practicing and litigating in other jurisdictions?
You want to go first, Dan, or my experience, Albert, has been generally, for the most part, so my firm Willkie has 7 domestic offices. We've got East Coast, West Coast, plus Houston. If we have litigation in one of the cities where we Willkie have an office, we usually have one of our partners from that jurisdiction who's licensed in that state, in that jurisdiction, on the papers. She or he can then be one of the lawyers on the case. But virtually in every case that we work on, I assume the same is for Dan and Kurt, if it's not in the state in which you're barred, you file what's called a pro hoc vice motion. You ask the court permission, and you essentially have to fill out, a form that says, I'm an attorney in good standing in the state of Illinois. I've never been, found to be deemed unfit. I've never had any, professional or unprofessional activities. And generally it's, a process you have to go through. It's one extra step. But for the most part, anyone who at least wants to do litigation is able to handle cases in any state court or federal court across the country. That's my experience.
Yeah, I mean, I would jump in and say that I do think that is somewhat unique to us litigators in that we do practice all around the country. And I think our transactional colleagues can sometimes be a little more geographically based. Not to say that they don't have clients in other geographic locations, but I just think it is par for the course for us litigators to be in courts all across the country, which is perhaps less so for our transactional colleagues.
The only thing I would add is just it's a little bit more practice specific for IP litigation is that so many of the matters that we work on are based in Delaware, the District of Delaware, and Foley doesn't have an office in Delaware. And so anytime we are dealing with a case in Delaware, we have to use local counsel, which would be true anytime we're dealing with a case that in a state where we don't have an office. But that's pretty much always the case for us in Delaware, which is a more patent heavy district.
And I guess, Albert, just on that point, Dan used a phrase that I know Kurt and Dan and I are all familiar with, but the idea of local counsel is, if you are handling a litigation anyway, in a city or state in which your firm doesn't have an office, virtually every court in the country, federal or state, requires there to be a local lawyer on the pleadings, or at least a lawyer who is licensed in that state. And so, for most of our litigation matters, if we're handling a case in a jurisdiction where we don't have our own law firm's offices, we will need to find a local law firm who will essentially be our partner on the case. And in every case, kind of the role and how involved they are is a little bit different, but you generally need to have a local law firm on the pleadings, to the idea being, assist you, know the local practice, that sort of thing. So that's what, when we use the phrase local counsel, that's what we mean.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks, Matt. Yeah, this has been very insightful, and I think this is very helpful to give students perspective about what it means to choose a location geographically, what that can mean for your practice, which is not very limiting. So in terms of working in Chicago, depending on the firm that we're all at big firms. I guess Kurt, we'll go back to you. So Winston and Strawn is headquartered in Chicago. Tell us a bit more what it's like to work for a firm that's a large firm, national firm that's headquartered in Chicago.
Yeah, Winston, we are the oldest law firm in Chicago, and certainly very proud of our Chicago roots. And from my perspective, all I know is practicing in a headquartered firm, or the headquartered office of a firm. But I think there can be advantages of both, and I would also say that, to the point that was just made, we end up working with a lot of lawyers from a lot of our different offices. And so, I think with technology, especially, and coming out of the pandemic and just being less tied to specific geographic locations, I think there's certainly less sort of local nature to it. But I enjoy being at sort of where we were founded and where we're headquartered. We obviously have a long history in the city that we're really proud of, and are very involved, and just known as a Chicago institution, as part of the broader business community. And so I think that part is really nice. But as far as the practice of law goes, I think it is always nice to be in a place that has a good number of lawyers where decisions are made, and you see folks that are active in the management of the firm. But as I said, we and many other places have multiple offices and collaborate across them regularly.
Yeah, thanks, Kurt. So Dan, on to you. Foley's headquartered in the Midwest, I guess a few steps away from Chicago. So tell us about what that's like.
Sure. So as I said, Foley is headquartered in Milwaukee. But Chicago, this isn't exactly don't quote me on this, but Chicago sort of serves as HQ2, if you will. It's very much a hub of firm activities, partly geographically, and also just because it's an incredible city. It's easy to get to, a lot of amenities. So a lot of firm activities happen here. Retreats and orientations. We recently had partner retreats, summer associate retreats. So it's not sort of some far-flung kind of satellite office where you are left feeling left out. Chicago is very much in the thick of what's happening at Foley. And it's also a really short drive or train ride up to Milwaukee. I've done that train ride up in the morning to get up there for a client meeting or for a deposition. So that it's a little bit of an unusual case that it's so close to the headquarters. Some of our firm leadership and management still is in Milwaukee, but that's kind of happenstance at this point. Our previous CEO was in Milwaukee, but our current CEO is in Detroit. The chair of our IP department is currently in Milwaukee, but the previous chair was in DC. So folks are spread out, leadership is spread out, and as Kurt said, a lot of collaboration across offices.
Yeah, and looking into those types of factors as a law student when looking at an office that's not the headquarters are important. So that's great perspective. Matt, how about you? So Willkie, headquartered in New York, what's that like?
Yeah, Albert, I've got an interesting perspective here, maybe unique to Daniel and Kurt, in that I've been at both types of firms in Chicago. So a group of 6 of us started the Willkie office in Chicago 4 years ago on March 31st, 2020, right as the pandemic was starting. So perfect timing. But prior to that, I spent 23 years in the headquarters of a big Chicago-based law firm. So I've seen both sides of it. I agree with everything that Kurt and Dan said. I think that there are undoubtedly benefits to being at kind of, headquarters, home base. I think just from the benefit of resources, support, kind of where the rest of the offices view things, that's obviously a plus for certain. But I can also say that at the right firm, where there is support, and it sounds like it's certainly the case at both Dan and Kurt's firms, when we did our research, we wanted to make sure that we would have the support of headquarters. And look, it's a collaborative process. It was in New York's interest for the Chicago office to succeed, and the Chicago office needed to kind of rely on New York for support, technical support, and things like that. So look, I think if you choose the right firm, and it may be, quite frankly, a little bit harder for law students to understand that kind of in doing your investigation. But I do certainly think that if there's any concern whatsoever for somebody thinking about joining for a summer program, kind of the non-headquartered hub, I would ask associates, see if you can get a true, honest answer. But in my experience, in our experience here in Willkie, Chicago, it's been nothing but collaborative, partner, strategic, and the like. So.
Fantastic. So I guess we talked about what it's like to work in Chicago, and I think a big part of that is the connectivity with other offices throughout the country, and oftentimes that doesn't necessarily tie you down to working for clients in Chicago. I guess let's pivot briefly to talk about what it's like to live in Chicago, and that's always an important factor for students that are considering Chicago as one of the locations they're interested in. So I'm curious what it's been like living for you living in Chicago as a young professional or with a family. What is that experience like generally? I guess Dan, let's start with you. Curious to hear about that a little bit.
Sure. So I guess I'm still in the young professional without a family category. So I live right in downtown. I'm probably about a 10-minute walk from our office in River North, the River North neighborhood here. I love living in Chicago. I've lived in smaller cities, St. Louis, Madison, Wisconsin. I lived in bigger cities in New York. For me, Chicago is just sort of the happy medium. It's got the big city feel and the downtown area and all of the amenities that come with that. And then it has, if you haven't been to Chicago, it has sort of every flavor or character of neighborhood you could want. Whatever your preferred entertainment is, Chicago has it. I personally love being by the lake. We've got a nice river walk, a lot of green space. I love that I don't have to have a car in the city. It's got pretty good transit. You can get really anywhere you need to. And I like living that sort of that sort of city life. I mean, it's something that I appreciated about New York. But Chicago is a little more my size, my speed. So I'm not, there may come a day where I retreat to the suburbs, but I'm not in a hurry to do so.
Right. Love it. Matt, Kurt, anything you'd like to add there?
Well, maybe we can segue to the retreat to the suburbs part, because I think Matt said he was staying in the city, born in the city, staying in the city. Which I said at one point as well, but ended up moving out to the suburbs. Almost, I guess 10 years ago now. So I spent roughly the first 10 years of my career living in the city in Lincoln Park, and then moved up after my second child was born and my wife took a job in the suburbs to a northern suburb. And so I've seen it both. Obviously love Chicago as a city, and the vibrancy of living in the city. And as a young professional, I think being downtown in the mix, in whatever neighborhood suits your fancy is just I have many great memories of, and would highly, highly recommend it. But if you come a point where perhaps your family's growing, perhaps you need a bigger yard, whatever the case may be, there are a lot of livable suburbs in and around Chicago with ready access to the city via the train, which I take almost every day as opposed to driving. And you can make it work either way.
So Matt, let's see. Are you going to stay in the city your whole life? Kurt's predicting that you might be flexible on that. So curious to hear more about that.
No, no flexibility there. So, so we've got two daughters, 20 and 18. So we're kind of through the need for a yard. They're more taking Uber back down to Lincoln Park to the bars. But we live in a neighborhood called Roscoe Village, which is essentially just west of Wrigley Field, down Addison Street. We've lived in a couple of other neighborhoods. But look, I agree with everything Dan and Kurt said. I think if you are at a point in your life, in your career where you want to be close to the city, whether it's walking like Dan does from downtown, or even being, you know, a short 1 or 2 or 3, in Chicago, we call it the L stops away. There's kind of this vibrancy of neighborhood. Chicago is essentially a city of neighborhoods. And there's, you know, you can get downtown from Lincoln Park where Kurt used to live. There's a whole series of neighborhoods kind of heading out towards O'Hare, Wicker Park, Bucktown, and the like that are kind of a haven now for young professionals. And then, you know, whether it's at any point in your life you head out to the suburbs, I agree with Kurt. It is a very accessible city by way of the trains. There's regular trains that go in every direction, north, west, south. And at least for me, many of my partners live in the city, but several live kind of in the western suburbs, and they take what we call the Metro every day to and from work. And, you know, it is a very accessible and easily getting around city for certain.
Great. So I'm curious to hear, and before we jump into some of the Q&A, we have some good questions in the Q&A. I guess before we jump into that, quick reminder: if you haven't already, we sent the Word document in the Zoom chat. So definitely download that and open the Zoom links and save them so you can access those at 7:10 Central to enter the whenever we finish with the panel to enter the breakout rooms. We also put in the chat the link to join the raffle, so make sure you do that before we finish up, so you can be eligible when we call out those names later. All right, so I guess what are some common exit opportunities? And I guess by the term exit opportunities, when we use that phrase, it's thinking about what you might want to do, I guess, after your life at a law firm. Of course, you know, every firm wants everybody to stay forever, but I think most firms are cognizant that that's not always the case, and supporting their attorneys to go on do other things is important, including, you know, coming back as clients or just growing in their own way. So exit opportunities is kind of what you might do afterwards, and it's always something that's important to think about in your career. So I guess I'm curious to hear from a couple of you. What are some common exit opportunities for big law attorneys in Chicago within your particular practice that you see?
Well, look, on the litigation side, a couple that jump to mind. One is obviously government. We have, you know, several of our associates who maybe go clerk. I think that working before clerking has become a far more common thing to do than maybe when Kurt and I were coming out of law school. I think many people went straight clerking before law school. So clerking, if people have interest in being a federal prosecutor or state prosecutor or otherwise working for the SEC or another government body, that's obviously an opportunity. And then, you know, I think what is probably the most common if you started a big firm is finding an opportunity in-house, perhaps at a client of the firm, perhaps at a client that you've worked for, or you know, where you've worked on a matter for a particular client. So those are the two that immediately jump to mind. There's obviously lots more.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things, obviously agree with all that, though, is if you come and start your career in a big city at a big firm, like we're all talking about here, your opportunities, you will have opportunities to do other things if you decide that's not for you. And the one thing that you're going to get at a firm like those representatives is you're going to get great training. You're going to get an excellent base for the career that you're jumping into. And so whether it be going to clerk, going into the prosecutor's office, going to a client, going to a different firm in Chicago or a different city, maybe even, all of those opportunities are available. And by spending a couple years at a place like all of ours that we're talking about here, will set you up with opportunities if you decide that there is something else that you want to do.
Absolutely. Dan, anything to add there, or pretty much agree?
I agree with what Matt and Kurt said, and I guess I would just note on the IP side, I think it's for folks who are looking to leave the big law firm life. It's common to look out for smaller, more mid-sized firms. There are a lot of boutiques, particularly in the IP space. So I'm not necessarily leaving firm life altogether, but sort of a bit of a change of scene in terms of the size of the firm.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think the small mid-sized firm nuance, it really isn't practice specific. So that's a great point. All right, so let's move on to one or two questions that we got on the Q&A before we jump into our last question in our raffle. So this is a great question. It's something that comes up often when I speak with students and laterals about thinking about a new market. So something that oftentimes comes up outside of markets like New York and DC is kind of proving your ties to that place. And that might be something that folks care about when looking at candidates. So one question we have here is, what advice would you give to students who don't have super strong ties to Chicago, but really love the city and want to work there ideally? Any thoughts there?
I would just say have an answer to the question, because you're going to be asked, right? And it needs to be genuine. And it's okay if you've never lived here. But advocate for yourself and be believable if it is really where you want to be, because we do want to know that you are interested in coming to our city and staying there. And so there's no sort of minimum contacts like you're learning about in constitutional law required to practice here, but we do want to know what your story is. And so to the extent that you have a tie, we want to hear about that. And so be prepared to the answer as to be more than just, it's a city that I kind of like, and you'll be all right.
I agree with that 1,000%. I think that, when I interview people, whether they're a summer candidate or a lateral candidate, associate candidate, and there's not kind of a logical Chicago connection that jumps off the page, that question will come up in an interview. And I agree. Have a truthful, genuine, honest answer, whatever it is. It's my partner, got transferred there. She's teaching at Northwestern, and I'm moving back. Great, I get it. Or I'm from the Midwest. I want to work in the largest, biggest legal market in the Midwest, and I chose Chicago. Whatever it may be, have something ready, because you will be asked for certain.
And I would just add, maybe sort of show that you've done your homework a bit. If you've never been to Chicago before, maybe plan a visit. Maybe take a look at some neighborhoods where you think you might want to live. Learn a little bit about them and be able to speak to some of the specifics about what in Chicago interests you and sort of what you envision for yourself there.
Yeah, that's a really good advice, and I think whoever asked that question is already doing something right, because you're on the Chicago virtual session and probably learned a lot about the neighborhoods, the type of work, the type of clients, and I think that could probably go a long way. And I agree, that's really good advice. So that's great. So I want to make sure we have enough time to finish up and head into our breakout room. So last chance to join the raffle for some prizes we'll give away. So we're going to move on to our last question, which is always a fun one. And it's I guess now is a chance for everyone to plug the firm. So I guess in 30 seconds or less, why should someone choose your firm? We have a rule here at Summer Associate Hub. We have some recurring attendees that have started joking around about this rule, which I believe is an important one, which is the answer can't be it's the people, because as a 1L and a rising 2L, you'll go through the process and you'll notice during interviews, during networking events, the answer seems to always be it's the people. So our rule here is the answer can't be it's the people. So in 30 seconds or less, tell us, why should someone choose your firm? So I guess, Dan, let's start with you. 30 seconds or less, why should a student choose Foley?
Sure. Well, I'm sure is the case for Matt and Kurt too, part of the answer is the people. But for Foley, we have a national reach. We offer a full spectrum of legal services. With those things comes a lot of opportunities that you might not otherwise have with a more geographically limited firm, or a more specialized firm in terms of practice areas. For me, Foley has a well-respected IP practice. If that's your interest. And another thing I think is just that Foley is actively growing, and in terms of headcount, number of offices, we recently had a merger that expanded our presence in Texas and California, opened up a Salt Lake City office, and being part of a growth story is something that is very exciting for me.
Fantastic. Thanks, Dan. So we have a prize sponsored by Foley. We'll connect the winner with the team at Foley afterwards to get your prize. The winner is Dasha Ignatova. If you're with us, please let us know in the Q&A that you are here, so we can get you that prize. All right. So Matt, you're next. 30 seconds or less. Why should a student choose Willkie?
So as I mentioned, we opened on March 31st, 2020 with 6 partners from a large Chicago firm. We're now at 85 lawyers, growing rapidly. Willkie's a tremendous firm, 1,200 lawyers, 14 offices across the United States and Europe. I think if you want to practice at the highest levels on the most sophisticated, interesting legal matters, whether litigation, private client, corporate M&A, private equity, it's a great place in the Chicago office to get in on an office that will continue to grow over the next few years. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say the people, because we really have a great group of diverse, interesting, fun people that you wouldn't mind sitting around having a cup of coffee or a drink with. So
You violated the Summer Associate Hub rules of civil procedure, but it's okay. That's a great answer. All right, so the Willkie branded tote bag with some fun Willkie swag items. Jack Webb, you're the winner. If you're with us, let us know in the Q&A. All right, Kurt, on to you. 30 seconds or less. Why should a student choose Winston?
Yeah, I could never do it in 30 seconds, but happy to talk afterwards. I think one of the nice things about Winston, obviously we have the deep roots, as I mentioned, but a national practice on top of that. So a firm that is part of the fabric of the legal scene in Chicago and has been from the start, working on cutting edge legal issues across the country and the world, frankly, and come work with some really good people, but I won't say it's all about the people.
Great. All right, cool. Well, last prize of the night, the Winston Yeti tumbler, which is always a good prize. We have Stephanie Bersmeyer. If you're with us, please let us know in the Q&A. You have a few seconds, and Jack Webb also. Please state your name in the Q&A before we wrap up. Well, thanks everybody for a fantastic discussion. This was really insightful, helpful for students interested in the Chicago market, but also just generally to understand how to position themselves throughout this process. And I appreciate you taking the time to join us. I hope students can join us in the breakout rooms. I'll pop the Word document just one last time in the chat in case you missed it. This document has all of the breakout rooms for the different firms. The wonderful attorneys on our panel will be sticking around, taking time out of their evening to chat with folks. So definitely take advantage and ask questions along with the recruiting team members of the different firms. One thing I always like to recommend to our attendees is don't just squat in one room. Join the room, hang out, ask a question, learn a little bit, but it's always good to bounce around and hear different perspectives from the different firms, especially as everybody takes time out of their evening. Well, thanks again for everybody for joining us. I hope you could join us for our future sessions coming up, including our real estate practice session tomorrow, Tuesday, February 27th, as well as our other sessions coming up in the coming weeks. summerassociatehub.com/events. You could sign up for the rest of those there. And thanks again to Dan, Matt, and Kurt for this really great discussion.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks everyone.